On April the 1st, Luciana Bone of Edinburgh University, PA, with whom I worked for many years at Edinburgh University, put up a post on Facebook, and the post said the following, I quote, "So why does the US political establishment and their economic trainers hate Putin's Russia?" Is the question she poses, and she has 10 points. Number one, because Russia thwarted the US in Syria. Number two, because Russia denied the best part of Ukraine to the US, that is Crimea and the Donbass. Number three, because Russia trumped sanctions by forging economic alliance with China. Number four, because Russia rebuilt military and scientific strength after US degraded it. Number five, because there is still public wealth to privatize in Russia and the US can't get its hands on it. Six, because Russia has declared sovereignty and is capable of military defending itself. Seven, because the US has learned nothing from Russian history and continues to dream Napoleonic and Hitlerian dreams of conquest. Number eight, because Russia refuses to comply with Anglo-American racism of considering Slavs as a subject race. Nine, because Russia birthed socialism. And 10, because Russia used to be the USSR. I responded to that, made a comment on that quote, saying that Luciana had nailed it. And I guess it is for that reason that Ed Clunan invited me to be part of this. And not because I have any particular expertise on the subject. But let me just elaborate on a few of the points that Luciana mentioned in that. I agree, I do think she nailed it, but I perhaps wouldn't share absolutely everything she says, but most of it, yes. So, the West in general, and the US in particular, can never forgive the Russians for overthrowing not only the monarchy aristocracy, the czars of Russia, but also capitalism in 1917 by forming a workers' people's social soldiers' republic. So if you like, the former Russia, or Russian Empire actually, it kind of skipped the capitalist phase. It went straight from monarchy to socialism stroke communism. And the West can never forgive them for that. The armies of the West invaded the new socialist republic, communist republic, in an attempt to overthrow it, and they never came to terms with this abomination, what they considered an abomination. They attacked the nascent republic from every possible angle, including militarily, co-opting religious, social, and political institutions, etc., around the world in their combat. The repressive and authoritarian form which the Soviet Union adopted eventually may well be attributed in great part, I think, to the reaction to these threats to the new state. The new state had to defend itself mightily against the forces, the capitalist forces around the world, which were determined by all and every means to destroy it. The West and the capitalist world in reality carry a great amount of the blame for any authoritarian or dictatorial shape that the state eventually took there. My next point is that during World War II, the Soviets joined with the West in fighting fascism in a peculiar kind of an alliance. During the war, Winston Churchill, and he is on record for doing this and for saying this, he deliberately delayed mounting the Western Front against Hitler because he declared he would like to see the Soviets and the Germans mutually decimate each other first before they would intervene in the West. And this was the kind of an alliance it was. For Churchill and his likes, and also for the leaders in the United States, they considered the greater threat was not Hitler and fascism, but it was actually socialism and communism. The world run by workers and by the producers. After the war, the same Winston Churchill, he came here to the US to stir up the flames of war against the Soviets, stroke Russians. His famous speech in Fulton, Missouri on March the 5th, 1946, stoked the flames of the Cold War, which continued until the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1990. I think, me personally, and I here have to confess a certain bias in regard to Churchill, but I think he's one of the greatest criminals of the 20th century.
Great.
And is responsible for so much of the calamities that the world endured. A very, very nefarious character. He also, incidentally, fought against the Boer War, and he was part of the intervention after the Soviet victory in 1917. Even though the former Soviet Union became gradually a nuber capitalist country after 1990, the animosity has continued for many of the reasons that Luciana mentioned in the quotes that I began with. The US and the West, it wants Russia to return to its former status of an underdeveloped country with abundant natural resources and markets that the West wants to exploit. And that's what is determining a lot of the policy in regard to the Russian Federation today. Now, the question of Russia intervening in the U.S. elections in 2016, let me say a few words about that. And of they supposedly swinging the elections in favor of Trump. Is that mine?
Yeah, I think that's yours. Somebody doesn't agree with you.
What? Yeah.
That's Luciana.
Yeah, that must. Yeah. Sorry about that, folks. So, from what we know, it certainly seems that there were efforts to swing the elections in Trump's favor in various ways. But to attribute his winning the election to the Russian collusion and intervention seems outlandish. Trump won the elections, we might say fairly, in inverted commas, by tapping into the basest instincts of the US population. That is, by using racism, misogyny, Islamophobia, and immigrant bashing. It is by appealing to these instincts that he won, and not by any external intervention, in my opinion. And the Democrats lost the election not due to Russian intervention, but by putting forward a candidate who was the most hawkish that they could find, and who, with her $250,000 lecture fees, showed her alienation from the pains and struggles of most of the American people. And that's why they had a better candidate if they did want to win, but they knew what they were doing, and that's what they chose. But they choose now to to blame Russia for their debacle. When one hears the daily drumbeat about Russian intervention and collusion on MSNBC, CNN, and all these other outlets, liberal outlets, one has to wonder how they feign such shock and outrage. Do they know anything of the history of the U.S. since 1945? U.S. intervention in elections has been made through threats, assassinations, and military intervention. To mention a few, Greece and Italy in 1946, the overthrow of Mohammad Mossadegh in Iran in 1953, of Jacobo Arbenz in Guatemala in 1954, of João Goulart in Brazil in 1964, Salvador Allende in Chile in 1973, Saddam Hussein in 2003, and Afghanistan in 2001. What was his name? The blind, I can't think of his name.
Najibullah?
What?
Najibullah?
Najibullah was before him, but... Huh?
I believe it's Mohammed Omar.
Mohammed Omar.
The Taliban leader.
That's the guy that they overthrew in 2001. So by comparison, any Russian intervention seems to have been a very low-key operation. But these commentators who spin this thing seem to be unaware completely of what intervention in the politics of other countries has meant for the United States. Trump's rapprochement with Vladimir Putin and the Russians would seem to be his only redeeming policy approach, for which the Democrats should be praising him for. Having said that, however, I would tend to believe that Trump's closeness to Russians has little to do with state policy and all to do with the Trump's financial empire and investments. The investments of Russian oligarchs in Trump Towers, casinos, and real estate adventures, and so on. So that's my biased understanding of what Trump is up to, and basically the position of the Democratic Party to me is absurd. So that's as much as I have put together formally. There's an awful lot more to say. By the way, I would like to make a pitch for Dan Kovalik's book, The Plot to Scapegoat Russia, where there's much greater detail in many of the things that I just kind of touched on.
I think you see why we were inspired to do this forum. Michael had an article in the New People, which I think Plunin read and shared with me and a bunch of other people, and we were very much impressed about this topic, and I think what he's expressed here is cogent. You may want to, I tried to find it on the internet. It's not on the internet. I was going to make copies, but it's a really fine article. If you have back issues of the New People, you ought to look it up. Oh, thank you. Don't cover my stuff up here. I got all my stuff here now. So, well, I think it's a good time just to take a moment and congratulate a couple of our friends here who worked very, very hard on this recent election campaign. Jan and Tony worked very hard for one of the two candidates that took down the Costas. And I'm really, there's lots of pitfalls and lots of missteps possible in the future, but I'm really elated to hear that we're off to a start. We desperately need in Pittsburgh an oppositional forum, an oppositional force to confront the people that run this city today. Also, I'd like to just mention off subject that we had a very important event today with the marriage, and I think we ought to acknowledge the fact that the people of the UK spend every year around £42 million to sustain that royal family. Elizabeth herself gets a sustainer of about £8 million a year, and probably another million or so are distributed among the rest of the royal family to keep them in their
That's pounds, not dollars.
those are pounds, which would be multiplied by what, 1.5?
Yeah.
Fair enough.
1.6.
The corgis probably get more money. The corgis probably get more money.
And-
Most better than Ricky.
You know, they are still the largest landowner in England. I mean, they own, now it's held in kind of receivership by the government. It doesn't like literally belong to them, but that's what funds much of their activities. But back to this subject. I knew that Michael would do a fine job of covering this in great detail, so I picked out a couple of niches that I wanted to talk about that might be different. And one is to give a little perspective on Russia today. First of all, I've always been a strong advocate of the Soviet Union, so I'm not anti-Soviet by any means, but I emphasize that Russia is not the Soviet Union. It's a capitalist country, and its behavior is largely capitalist behavior. On the other hand, it plays a role in the hierarchy of imperialism that's adversarial, because all capitalist countries, in a real sense, and in the end game, are adversaries of one another. That's what creates wars, essentially. All wars have been that. And we've all grown up, I think it's fair to say everybody in this room has grown up with understanding the confrontation with communism as being the essential, fundamental U.S. adversary. Well, it's shifted now today, and so there's a number of countries that are vying for autonomy. But since 1991, Russia has been a capitalist state, and it's behaved like a capitalist state. If you go back to 1993, Yeltsin, who was then the president and one of our favorite people, Yeltsin had the military blow up the Supreme Soviet. It's a forgotten event, but the Supreme Soviet was going against his wishes and wills and his policies. So he sent the military in, and they killed a couple thousand people to bring it back into the capitalist orbit, because the communists had a greater and greater role and a greater and greater voice, so they stopped that. Then again in 1995, and this goes to what Michael said about intervention. If you go back to 1995, the Communist Party dominated the Duma. The Supreme Soviet became the Duma, which was the term that the Russians used in the olden era. And Yeltsin's popularity had sunk to 8%. Civil servants hadn't been paid in 6 months. The economy was going down the toilet. Things looked bad. So the supporters, the capitalist supporters of Yeltsin, got together and decided they were going to change things. They were going to resist this. Well, he couldn't do it by themselves. Election spending in Russia was limited in 1996 to $3 million per candidate. So Bill Clinton, who was a good friend of Yeltsin's, he arranged for the IMF to extend a loan of $10.2 billion to Yeltsin, some of which went to pay off the civil servants, so they were happy, to invigorate the economy, and a lot of it was just siphoned into the elections. And it wasn't just the oligarchs, and obviously that was U.S. meddling. I mean, do I have to make that point, beat that to death? That's U.S. meddling, because today's news, they're going to extend a loan to Argentina to bail them out. And in the local paper, it agreed that the IMF does not make these loans without U.S. compliance, with U.S. okaying it. So that's the way things worked then. In addition, Bill was able to arrange for some campaign advisors. This was revealed by the LA Times after the fact. And much money was sent over to engage this. And black campaigns were held in which they would send out a flyer and say, Zuganov, the communist candidate, will be in this city. Well, he wasn't going to be there, and everybody's mad. Or they'd send out information saying, Zuganov says this. It's a black campaign. Voter fraud was incredible, and it was orchestrated by a group of American advisors working out of a hotel in Moscow. And you can go to Wikipedia, which is what I do because I'm too lazy to read lots of news stories, and you'll find this confirmed. So that's the kind of backdrop to intervention. If you want to look at intervention, that's a backdrop to it. We do it, we did it, and we do it massively. Well, Putin was a deputy or a friend of Yeltsin's, and he was okay until in the late 90s, the U.S. started reneging on a deal they had made with Gorbachev, and that deal was not to move NATO any further east than Germany. That deal was made by Baker, who was the Secretary of State under Bush. It was made in 1990. It was reiterated several times. It was reiterated by NATO allies. And late in the 90s, the backtracking stopped. And so Putin, who was perfectly happy to be a friend, an ally of the United States, began to question that. That was number one. Then in the early 21st century, Bush forced Exxon to drop its role in helping develop oil technologies in Russia. That got Putin's attention again. So the recognition that the U.S. was not going to play ball was very early on in that Russian period. And the hostilities towards Russia go back to that intrusion, go back to when the U.S. government was setting up anti-missile systems on the borders of Russia, go back to these changes in the oil economy in Russia. And that's where a lot of this really flows from. Now, that brings us to the modern period, and Michael did a fine job of explaining the deep politics of it. When the Russian thing started to unfold during the election of Trump, I was thinking maybe, just maybe, this is going to be a temporary thing. They're going to use Russia as a scapegoat for the Democratic Party's failure, blah, blah, blah. Then in January of 2017, the CIA, the FBI, NSA, the security agencies met with Trump, and they did a classic J. Edgar Hoover type move. They shared a document with him, and it was this infamous dossier from, what's his name? Steele dossier. And this is what J. Edgar Hoover did consistently for 30, 40 years. He would take politicians aside, and he would say, I've got this dirt on you, and then he would just say, I'm not trying to make anything of this. I'm trying to protect you. I want you to know this is available. It was a kind of subtle way of intimidation. And they did that. And it came to my attention that same time there was an interview with Brennan in January of 2017. Brennan says some remarkable things about the dossier. He says, first of all, this is not intelligence community information. He distanced himself from it. And the interviewer says, well, why did you give it to him? Well, he says the FBI thought he should know about it. You know, it's a piece of information that would be good that he know about it. And he says, I don't attest to it. He says, where does he say it here? I'll quote him. He says, was I a leaker of this? No. I didn't know anything about it. And he says, I will not attest to its validity. It is not a document. It is not a CIA document. I will not attest to it. So I realized that there's a gang-up occurring here. And of course that led sometime afterwards to the beginnings of the Mueller investigation. Now it's been a year since Mueller started this. So I'm with a friend of mine yesterday at the gym. He's a good liberal, believes all this nonsense. And I said, well, you know, it's a year. I mean, is there nothing developing? Oh, yeah, there's a lot that came out of it. But you got to understand, he says, that these investigations take a long time. And he referred me to Nate Silver's website. What is it, 653, 658, whatever, 538. And that's a very prominent website from this guy that does all the polls. And see, the article has a beautiful chart of all these government investigations that occurred over the last 30, 40 years with special investigators. And I don't have time or interest to go through them all, but the first one is Watergate. And it shows a 4-year period. And it took 4 years for them to get to the bottom of things with the special investigator. I go to Wikipedia, my trusty source, and I find out that, in fact, Archibald Cox was appointed on May 19th, 1973. He was fired by Nixon. Jaworski picked up in November 1st, 1973. So remember, that's November 73. And by August 9th, 1974, it was wrapped up and Nixon resigned. So you look at these things, and these good, honest liberals see them and they believe them. I mean, it was just sheer nonsense what was said. So let's go through the indictments, the Mueller record, what he has so far. He lodged an account against George Papadopoulos. You know who George Papadopoulos was? He was a fairly recent graduate of college. He's a guy with a big ego. He wanted to be a big shot. He wanted to be taken notice of. He was on the verge of being allowed into the Trump campaign. He's going around, he's bragging to everybody how important he is. And he lied to the FBI about meeting with a historian that we've never heard of again. As some historians supposed to have Russian connections. He pleaded guilty. That's a big accomplishment. Then they grabbed Michael Flynn. Remember Michael Flynn? He was indicted on November 30th and pleaded guilty on December 1st of one count, false statements. You know what he was talking about? Israel had put him up into going to the Russian ambassador and seeing if they could get Trump, or the Russians, to not vote for a UN vote. The Russians would change their vote on a UN vote. So Israel was behind this, had nothing to do with Russia or Trump. He pleaded guilty, and he's gone. But the big fish is Manafort. So they're going after Manafort. October 27th, they lodge, you can't read this, a whole bunch of charges. Then again, in February of he doesn't budge. He fights it off. He's not, I'm not going to, I plead not guilty. Then they do 23 counts again in February. This is what you call, it's overwhelming a witness. There's a word for it. I'm not very good at these clever, witty things, but it's you overwhelm a witness with squeezing a witness. You lodge so many indictments against them that they have to give up. Now, he had an assistant, Rick Gates, and Rick Gates didn't have his means, didn't have his millions of dollars, wasn't the high flyer that Manafort was. So Gates eventually had to plead guilty because they kept stacking these charges against him again and again and again until he couldn't pay his lawyer. And that's what they're trying to do with Manafort at this particular time. Now, Manafort's a scumbag. And he's been a scumbag for 30, 40 years. He's been a Republican operative, but he'll work with Democrats too. He's all about money. Has nothing to do with Russia, little to do with Russia. He has connections with Ukraine. He will sell his soul to anybody. Then we have Richard Panetta. He pleaded guilty on February 2nd, 2018 for one count of identity fraud. He stole somebody's identity. Russia? Trump? What's that all about? Then there's a big indictment and a big guilty plea by Alex van der Zwaan, a Dutch guy. He was sentenced to 30 days in prison and a $20,000 fine because he had met with Gates. Rick Gates was the assistant to Manafort. What did he do? He gave the FBI the wrong date of the meeting. That's his sin, and that's why he did 30 days and $20,000. Then the big catch were the Russians. And the beauty of the Russians are that they're outside U.S. jurisdiction, so they'll never come to trial. And they all have one count except for one guy who has 8 counts of conspiracy to defraud the United States. Now, what does that have to do with Trump? What does that have to do with Russia? The Russian government? Who knows? Nothing at all. So this is where we are. This is the actual substance of what Mueller has done to date. And, like my liberal friend, compare that to the Watergate. Does this sound like the Watergate to you? If you're my age, you know what the Watergate was. It was a serious, serious deal. This is not an investigation. It's a joke. It's a farce. And let me give you some examples, and I'll close on this, of some of the ridiculousness that's going on around this Russiagate. Remember Lawrence Tribe? Many of us kind of thought highly of him as a liberal professor. There was a plane that went down, I think it was in February, in Russia. A plane crashed, very tragic accident. He goes public and says that Putin may have been responsible for the death of an important conspiracy-related person in the airline crash. So he takes this tragedy and he exploits it. He's a law professor at Harvard Law School, venerated professor.
What's his name again?
Lawrence Tribe.
Oh yeah, he's
A big name. I mean,
he's an evil genius.
the guy that he thought was murdered by Putin wasn't on the plane. He never was. He wasn't. There's no reason to believe that. Just admitted that. Then there's the Washington Post and NPR, and they're among the best at this stuff and the worst at distortions. They drag out Asha Ranapa, and she's now a law school dean at Yale. And when she's interviewed recently, she said, "I've been voted America's hottest female law school dean." So that's good to know. But she put 3 years into the FBI. Now, what she did, whether she was a clerk or whether she was a leader or whatever she was, she's an expert. And she goes on and on about the FISAs. You know what the FISAs are? F-I-S-I. Those are those things our Gestapo goes to the courts, the secret courts, and our Gestapo says we need to find out what Cloonan's up to. We need to get a court order to allow us. It's completely behind the scenes. None of this ever comes public. It can't be challenged. You can't find out about it. These are FISA hearings. She says, look, all these FISA warrants that the FBI has gotten, all of them, you can't take them lightly. There has to be cause. So we know there's something fishy going on because these FISA courts are rigid and rigorous, and they check everything out. But she didn't point out that out of 35,529 FISA requests from 79 to 2013, 12 were denied. That's rigor. That's checking. That's the kind of story you get. And NPR doesn't mention that. They don't say, oh, it's a rubber stamp. And then you've got the Dutch foreign minister using the same strategy. Halbe Zylstra. He says that 2 years ago he overheard Vladimir Putin discuss grandiose plans to create a greater Russia hacked out of Eastern Europe and the Middle East. A few honest journalists came forward and demonstrated it could not possibly been the case that he overheard these comments. I mean, the logistics of it, where he was and where Putin was, just didn't fit. And he had to resign. He had to resign as the Dutch foreign minister. He made it up. I mean, what else can you say? He made it up. Then there was Radek Sikorski. You may know that name. He was once the foreign minister of Poland. Foreign minister? Yes, Polish foreign minister. He said that he personally overheard Putin express similar expansionist plans in 2008. He too was forced to retract. He labeled the claim as a surreal joke. Sikorski is the spouse of Ann Applebaum of the Washington Post, the rabidly anti-communist, crazed columnist that writes about Putin almost daily. And to close, there's our old friend Thomas Friedman. Doesn't get better than Thomas Friedman. Russia presents the biggest threat to our democracy today. Russia is undermining the very core of our democracy. Russia poisons American politics. Then he goes on, this is where things are in America today. Our FBI, CIA, and NSA, working with the special counsel, have done us amazingly proud. We must bring together our intelligence and military experts to mount an effective offense against Mr. Putin, the best defense of all. I read that as advocating war, and that's where we really are. If you want to understand our times, I think you need to understand it outside of the framework of the Cold War. The Cold War is over. And understand it in the framework of 1912, 1913, where you have all these capitalist, imperialist countries who are vying for positions in the world, competing with one another for markets and so on. For example, I don't want to step on Typhoon's toes, but you take Putin. One day, a fighter is shot down over Syria by Turkey and is crazed over Turkey as being bad, and the next day he's friends with Turkey. And this is the nature of imperialism. This is the nature of capitalist in an imperialist milieu, an imperialist setting. And that's what we're going through. And the main thing we've got to do is fight for peace. I mean, we've got to fight we don't need to take sides. We need to fight for peace in this thing. But an obstacle to peace is bringing rationality, bringing reason back into our discourse. I mean, this kind of insanity, the Mueller investigation, these commentaries that we looked at, it's insane. It's just totally insane, and it's going to lead us directly into confrontations that are going to be very, very painful. That's it.
But yeah, I mean, these days, if you tune in to any major news channel, whether it's New York Times, Washington Times, or that insidious, toxic NPR, it's clear that the witch hunt surrounding Russia is in full gear. The whole media continues to brandish baseless allegations against Russia, presenting public opinion that's really useful to the U.S. war machine, as Greg and also Michael earlier pointed out. And while it seemed like this Russiagate business started as a way for the Democratic Party to sort of avoid taking responsibility for the 2016 election failure, it's also converging with this other phenomena within the ruling class of justifying, or is it turning into a means to justify a major confrontation with Russia and China. And I'll try to also go into some details as to where we are in the political process as far as those two main phenomena. It wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that this is almost like a new, and I agree with Greg in that it's almost like a new Cold War, but it's a different sort of Cold War, and sort of a different flavor of McCarthyism. And of course, the McCarthyism, it's a topic on its own with people in this room who have actually gone through that repression, that anti-communist repression, is totally a different concept when obviously USSR, the Soviet Socialists, which I am also a major militant and fan of, was in place. Today, in a sense, that's different because today we don't have Soviet Union, it's Russia, and Russia is a capitalist country. But also, Russia has basically recovered from the disastrous decline in the economic sense after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Under Putin, it's taken back much of its resources, rebuilt its military. It's now the second largest, has the largest nuclear arsenal, and that's by Washington viewed as a major obstacle, along with China, to US's imperialist domination globally. And Russia's recent alliance with Syria has been a key factor in thwarting the regime change in operation by US imperialism, which they colluded with the other reactionary governments, whether they're in the region like Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, or other European powers like France, Britain. And while obviously Russia, being a capitalist power, has its own interests, it's also a fact that Russia's intervention in Syria in stopping that regime change operation has given the working people of Syria a breathing room and ability to be able to sort of keep a unitary, secular, nationalist state intact. Now, and this is a fact that's just so absurd to think otherwise, but that's what the liberal media is telling us, obviously. Hillary Clinton's defeat was not caused by Russian government hacking. It was the Democrats' complete abandonment of any pretense to advocate for the working class. It was Hillary Clinton's own anti-worker arrogance that really cost the election, and the very real perception that she was in the pockets of Goldman Sachs. And of course, both parties are in the pockets of Goldman Sachs or all the other big corporations. And Clinton, as a response to Trump's slogan, "Make America Great Again," the best thing she could come up with, "America is great." Well, it is great if you're rich, and if you're making money off the stock market, but if you lost your job and your home, as many millions did in the economic crisis, which then the Obama administration was more than willing to dump $1 trillion to salvage the corporate and the banks, it's not that great. So Clinton offered nothing but disdain and arrogance to those who are suffering. And also, it's important to note that accusing Russia of influence in the US elections came at a moment, the initial moment, was when WikiLeaks was about to reveal her 50,000 emails that exposed their sinister manipulation of their internal so-called democratic process so that they could steal the primary from Bernie Sanders, right? So that this whole Russia nonsense basically created that fog, that smoke screen for people to not question what happened in the leading up to the elections. And of course, the other thing to notice is while post-election the Democrats were vociferous in their Russia accusations in congressional hearings, they always surrender to the Democrats when it comes to other issues like DACA and many other economic issues, so they're all on the same boat. By conflating Trump with Russia, they just hope that it can propel them back to a Democratic majority in the Congress and the White House. As I mentioned, there's absolutely no proof of Russian government hacking into the US voter databases or in any sense to influence the elections. But as Michael and also Greg touched upon, there's absolute proof that US has been intervening in elections or other governments, sovereign governments' affairs for years. Just between 1946 and 2000, the US has interfered in 81 elections. This is between 1946 and 2000. It doesn't count what happened the second time in Iraq, Syria, Libya, Afghanistan, what's happening now in Venezuela. So right, I mean, Chile in 1973, as Michael mentioned, Congo, Republic of Congo in 1961, Guatemala, Nicaragua. The list is really for us too long to enumerate. And yes, Russia, intervention elections in Russia, Yeltsin, as Greg mentioned, $10.2 billion IMF loan that basically got him out of the trouble and has really handed him the elections. Otherwise, the Communist Party candidate Zhuganov was a possible winner. And this is following the collapse of the Soviet Union. So I want to quickly take a little more detailed look at where we are in the political process as far as the two sort of converging phenomena that I mentioned. One is that ongoing, almost like a sort of a major schism within the ruling class of the US empire, within the capitalist class. It's almost like a civil war due to this Trump election. And that's sort of converging with another longer-term realignment of US imperialism foreign policy stance. And that's also what makes, as Greg also alluded to, what makes this era extremely dangerous. Now, let me just briefly enumerate as far as what I see as this foreign policy military reorientation of the empire, objective-wise, what they achieve, what they aim to achieve. One is obviously encircling Russia and weakening it economically, so like covering it on all sides. Compete with China for dominance in Asia. Keep in mind, China is today's most dynamic economy of the world, and its impact is all over. Weaken the Russia-China alliance that's been forged in the recent years, and then carry out, possibly, if possible, regime change in Russia and China. And Russia, as Michael already said, so that they can actually go and have access to all the resources and markets that Russia would offer. Now, let me go back to the first phenomena that I mentioned, this interclass struggle that's going on inside, and it's a severe struggle. as obvious to everyone that Trump's victory was a surprise to many within multiple centers of the ruling class as well. And they want this presidency to end. Now, the opposition to Trump within the ruling class, I can categorize them as intelligence agencies, CIA, FBI, and now the liberals want us to believe that they are the champions of democracy. A foreign policy establishment cadre from both capitalist parties, Democrat and Republican, State Department professional staff, DC think tank establishments where these cadre go in and out of the government, and then of course all the leading mass corporate liberal media outlets. Now, they oppose Trump not because he's this disgusting racist, misogynist, anti-Muslim, anti-immigrant, all that. They don't oppose that. He's sort of unacceptable for them as the president of the United States because he's sort of dropping that mask where Clinton can talk in dog whistle in pseudo hidden racist language. Trump is not tactful enough. He's just basically making the situation obvious. And that's also why they were targeting Trump before even the elections, the FBI and the intelligence agencies. Now, I want to quickly, why the ruling class parts of the ruling class doesn't like Trump. I want to go back to actually a text from the Communist Manifesto, Marx and Engels. Back in the day, in the Communist Manifesto, they wrote this: the executive of a modern state is but a committee for managing the common affairs of the whole bourgeoisie. Now, those groups within the ruling class just simply does not think that Trump is qualified to represent the whole capitalist class and to be able to manage the affairs of the bourgeoisie. And now, as Greg also went in detail, the Mueller investigation is becoming the vessel for this anti-Trump elements in the ruling class to end this presidency. But I want to, for a second, sort of go to the liberal rhetoric and the ones that say impeach Trump and all that. Now, if they impeach Trump and if Trump's presidency ends, who would be the president? Now, Pence. Now, Pence is, I think, I would say, is an acceptable figure for the ruling class because he's sort of in. He knows how to manage these affairs. He will deal with. So it's really ridiculous, foolhardy for any part of the left, real left, of the working class socialist movement to ally itself with one or the other side of this struggle in the ruling class. Now, the interclass struggle, which is really driven by also the setback of the U.S. imperialism, the recent setback, whether it's in Syria and the challenges that they are facing in Asia against China. That coinciding, that's one of the reasons that's driving this major reorientation with the foreign policy. And so let me talk a little bit of that, where the reorientation of this U.S. foreign and military policy is really, as also Greg again mentioned, is preparing for a major power confrontation with Russia and China. Now, this is not just our analysis, right? They're actually openly talking about it. There's a document called the Nuclear Posture Review. It's a 2018 document. And they're spelling it out clearly in their own documents, making it crystal clear that U.S. is seeing Russia and China as the primary enemies, and they're preparing to actually confront them militarily. There's a lot of sort of quasi-diplomatic language, but when read between the lines, that's what they're really saying. Now, of course, all the historic reasons where they associate, and Soviet Union and what Michael all talked about, that aside, as far as this recent development, so why is Russia such a threat to U.S. imperialism? Why is it guilty in the eyes of U.S. imperialism? Now, let's go back to 2011 when the imperialists went ahead unchallenged in Libya, and they were able to basically overthrow a sovereign government. And Russia, at that point, did not intervene. They only, I think in the resolution, they just stayed neutral. But when it came to Syria, that was not the case. Russia did step up and stood up to the U.S. and refused to allow that regime change operation to succeed. They intervened, as I mentioned earlier, on behalf of the Syrian government and made it clear that the government would not be toppled by U.S. imperialism or its proxies. And on the field, this actually equates to ISIS and Al-Qaeda and all these extreme reactionary groups that are funded by essentially U.S. imperialism and its proxies in the region. And also, what happened in Ukraine in 2014. Now, there was a regime change operation there, instituted by the U.S., and literally an extreme right-wing, I would say neo-Nazis, and I'm not saying that in the rhetorical sense, they are actual Nazis that are in power, and they're welcomed by the U.S. empire. And I mean, after the fall of the USSR, all these former Soviet unions, one by one, being basically turned into NATO members, surrounding Russia all around, and Russia would not let a critical area like Crimea, which also historically is Russian. It's been Russian since 1700s. Majority is Russian, majority speak Russian, so they would not allow that to turn into another sort of a NATO operation for a possible confrontation with Russia. So they, they did not let that happen. And as earlier mentioned, it is really a new stage that we've entered, a very dangerous state. And I totally, wholeheartedly agree with Greg. It's really like 1912, where almost the writing is on the wall, where you see all these alignments and all these capitalist rivalries and blocs forming up. Like in 1912, if you ask people in Europe if they thought there was going to be a horribly devastating war in 2 years that would kill millions, and then another one to repeat in 20 years, I don't think they would conceive it. But it happened. The inter-imperialist and inter-capitalist rivalries, once they become unmanageable, they take a life of their own. And then once the escalation starts, once the opposing parties start on that escalation ladder, and once they start going up the ladder, it's very easy to take steps up the ladder, but it's very much more exponentially difficult to take the steps down the ladder. And I think we are sort of in that similar era, and for the genuine left, it's really imperative, and it's almost like a life and death situation for us to be able to be prepared, to be honest about what's happening. And that's why I also think that forums of this sort are critical, and I wish there were more attendance to hear this independent perspective laid out by the speakers. Because these phenomena that we talked about it's a process, and it's not going to end. And I think for us, especially in the heart of the U.S. empire, it's very critical that we let the public know about the real situation and also organize against a possible war, whether it's a smaller scale interventions in not smaller scale, it's a huge, but sort of proxy wars in Syria or all others going on. We're really at a very dangerous era. Thank you.